All right, folks, this is installment number 5 of our parenting videos, Christian Parenting 101. I see other people who have video pages tell people to like and then subscribe and then to share. And so I'm encouraging you to do that. I guess it promotes if you think it's worth promoting, I guess that's important. But please do that if you would. Uh, Today we're beginning with talking about personalities. My wife loves to speculate about when a new baby is born, what that baby's going to look like, who that baby's going to look like, what traits that baby's going to have physically. And I guess women in general like to do that and argue and agree and disagree about it. But I'd like us to think about doing that in regards to our children's personalities. Um, we should be speculating what type of personality does my child have, or do my children have. And I want to point out a mistake that I made, and I am assuming a lot of men make it. That is assuming that your children, especially your sons, fathers, that your sons are going to have the same personality as you. And my personality, growing up, I was very competitive, and my brother, who was just 14 months older than me, we were competitive with one another, and so competitive as we grew up that sometimes it ended in fistfights. So I anticipated that my sons would be as competitive as me, and my oldest, of course, received that assumption. And I remember being so very upset at him after a basketball game because I didn't see a fire in him. I didn't see a competitiveness that cared more about defeating his foe than anything else on the court. And what I came to slowly realize is that he loved sports just as much as I did, but he loved the camaraderie, he loved his teammates. Uh, the competitiveness was like third tier importance, where for me it was most important. And it took some adjusting to understand him and thus parent him appropriately. Um, that can also occur with the mother and daughter. Mother can assume that her daughter is going to be like her. And the example I came up with was a mother could not be boy crazy and not really care about dating or searching out a boyfriend, and she might assume that having a daughter, raising a daughter, that her daughter or daughters are going to be the same. And that daughter could be boy crazy, or that those daughters could care more about dating than their mother did. And what type of problems could that cause?
I can see the problem there being the mother could say things like, "I don't understand you," um, which just is going to then put a barrier in the relationship instead of inviting a relationship that she could come to the mother about anything
Yeah.
and not feel judged or not understood. I think we need to be careful about what we say um, to make sure that there's an open communication with not just boys. It could be um, the mom wants her daughter to wear dresses and she doesn't want to, or she wants her to be into the domestic arts and maybe she has no desire to cook and bake and things like that. And we just need to be careful not to come across judgmental to where um, we're putting any barrier in between the relationship.
Yeah, especially if it shut down communication. And I can see men doing the same thing. I don't understand you, son. You're so different than me. And that basically says, I don't want to understand you. And we certainly don't want to do that. So our advice, and this is very much hindsight, is to probe your children with the goal of discovering their personality tendencies. And we say tendencies. We don't believe that the personality is predestined, but we do believe that we have certain personality traits that we move towards, and they need to be trained, they need to be controlled, they need to be properly placed under the, the discipline of the Christian life. I got another example. I thought this one was important. Um, Again, because of my egocentric ways, I thought my second son would be like me because he's second born, like I was. And I always thought he was a little bit mischievous when he was young, like 2 and 3. And I was mischievous as a young boy. And then I learned or discovered that no, he was never mischievous. He was actually hiding from confrontation. He non-confrontational person and avoided it wherever he could. So getting in trouble to him was a horrible thing. And I, again, had to learn that and not put myself inside of him, but take him for who he was. And that brings us to the nature versus nurture debate. Which one dominates? Which one controls? And I wanted to bring up the idea of, because we have read articles about birth order and how that affects children. And we know biblically that the firstborn was given more in terms of, well, he was considered to have the birthright. He was given more in terms of inheritance and responsibility. If the father was to die, he was to take over and care for the family. And psychologically, we find today that firstborns have a tendency to care more about the unity of the family than other children, and thus they have certain personality traits. And we read articles that talked about things that we hadn't considered yet, that other children can have firstborn tendencies if they're born in a particular way, such as a child being 5 years apart from his oldest sibling, or being the firstborn girl or firstborn boy in the family. That those types of children can also exhibit firstborn personality traits. The point of all this is to say that all of us have something, whether it be birth placement, or just inherent personalities get passed down to us that are going to affect who we are. And so we need to try to identify those in our children to help better parent them. But I want to qualify all that to say that we know from Scripture that all of us are responsible for our sins, and all of us will stand before God, and we don't plead personality. We don't plead that our behaviors were a result of our personality or our personality tendencies. We are all responsible for our own sin, and our own sinful acts are not, will not be, and were not. I can put that one in there. The responsibility of anyone else but ourselves.
Including our parents, right?
Including your parents, yeah. That was my fear in thinking through this, was that it's too easy to blame our parents for our own sins, our own failures. And parents, you shouldn't allow your children to do that. Whether they're young or older, they shouldn't do that, because they will stand before God, and they will have to be accountable to God for their own sins. And they cannot blame you either. They can't blame your personality, and they cannot blame you. The only person that we need standing beside us on Judgment Day is Jesus himself. We know from Hebrews, it tells us that it is appointed for every man to die once, and then comes judgment. All of us need to be ready for that personally. It's true for our children, and it's true for us as well. And this leads us to discuss the differences that occur in parenting a teenager versus parenting children. All of us are aware, because we have lived it, that there is great power in increased hormones. That bubbly child can turn into a grumpy teenager seemingly overnight. And we saw it in every one of our children.
Absolutely.
As soon as those hormones hit, things definitely changed. Now, we had heard that, and we had this hope when we were young parents, that the teenage years will bear the fruit of what you put into your children when they were younger. Did we find that to be the case?
We didn't.
We did not. Now, some of it was.
Yeah.
It not entirely bad, but
I mean, I think we both agree that parenting the teenage years was the most difficult.
Yeah, to be sure. I felt quite in control when my children were young, and quite out of control when they were teenagers. But there's some positive things you can do. Positive things you can do for your children as they hit those teenage years and walk through them. First positive thing, make them go to church. Make them attend church. Make that a part of their identity that they cannot escape. You model it. You've got to model it. And this is an important point. I've heard of families that don't go to church because they're on vacation.
Yeah.
What? What? Did God's law, does the Word of God not apply when we're on vacation? It doesn't make any sense. Go to church when you're on vacation. Model the importance of going to church, the gathering together of the saints. Model it. Let your children see it as a priority in your life. Make it a priority in theirs. And even if they're grumpy, even if they don't want to go, or it's boring, whatever the excuse they have, you make them go. It's following that priority from 1 Corinthians 15. First the flesh, then the spirit. You get them in the church. You make them walk through the emotions of prayer and listening to the word read and preached, and then you have them receive the means of grace, the body and blood of Christ. That means of grace will come back for them. That means of grace will be there for them. It will be effectual in them. You have to believe that. So make sure that you put a priority of coming to church.
I think we're going to hit on it later too, but also not just you're on vacation, but extracurricular activities.
Mm-hmm.
You know, unfortunately, we don't live in the age where was it blue light laws they would have, where everything was shut down on
blue. They just call them blue laws.
Blue laws, okay. Everything's open, and unfortunately, a lot of sports teams play on Sunday, or whatever extracurricular activity your child is in. They think Sunday's just a day like it's Friday or Saturday. Yeah. So unfortunately, that makes it harder for us. But don't let it be an excuse.
Well, tell them what we used to do with Joel.
So, well, with any of our children who would have a conflict like that, it was important to us to honor the Sabbath day, and in order to do that, church was a priority. Worship was a priority. So after you worship, then you were free to do whatever. So when it would conflict, we would have our children seek out a church in our community that they could attend a service earlier than the service we offered. And they did that. And even one of our sons was involved with AAU tournaments, and he would travel a lot of different places, be Florida or wherever he was. And he knew he needed to go to church on Sunday. And so we would talk with the coach, and coaches were always so gracious to us and said, yeah, we'll make sure he gets to church. And there were times coaches dropped him off at a church on a Sunday and pick him up. Mm-hmm. And it was a witness that Joel, our child was able to say that this is important. Mm-hmm. There's something different about this kid. Yeah.
And we whenever they would go away to college, we would go with them, help them set up, but also help them find a church. And I would even search for churches before that, so we knew where we were going and the options that they had, to make sure that it was a priority, even in their college days, that they were worshiping God.
And we had to do that on vacation. We had to research the area and find a church that we would feel comfortable worshiping in.
We have gone to churches and walked out of them. When we found out certain things that this church offered, we're out of there, finding another church. We have a whole story about what happened in Florida that I won't tell you because it's embarrassing. But
we made every effort to go to church, but it failed.
It failed, and I just said, well, crying out loud, I'm a pastor, so let's have church at home. So that's what we did.
That was an exception, though.
Second positive thing, make them engage the world. Even more than when we were young, there's a temptation for a teenager to go in their room for hours on end and do things online, or just be morose and alone. Get them to engage the world. And for boys, I highly recommend sports, especially sports that cause a boy to face his physical fears. Whether it be staying in a batter's box when there's a flame-throwing pitcher, or whether it be holding their ground on the basketball court, or getting hit by a lacrosse ball, or getting tackled on the football field. Facing physical fear can bolster a young man's confidence, telling him that he can face that fear, he can stare it down, and he can survive, and thus survive again and survive again. That creates a chivalrous in him that he will likely not get in any other part of his life. I remember, I tell my boys this story, they repeat it back to me now, but I remember when I was in high school, my first drill, playing football in high school, they lined us up, even lines, and mano on mano. They'd throw the ball to one guy, and the other guy would just have to go tackle him. You just run at each other to see who was man enough to play the game. And I remember being in line, scared to death, hearing this cracking of the pads, And I look over and I count and say, okay, I'm the ninth guy in line. Here's the ninth. Oh, I can take that guy. And when it came my turn, going as fast as I could, putting down my head, bam! Both of us hit, fell backwards, and loved it because we survived. We did it. We figured out we could do it, and it makes you more brave the next time. Regarding leaving girls alone, what do you want to say?
Yes, I mean, it's similar to boys leaving them alone in their room, and now with all the social media going on. And I was reading how like a middle school teenager has such a greater percentage of suicide because of a lot of the shaming that goes on
Online.
Gossip is huge in that time period, like it always is, I guess. But anyway, yeah, there's some,
So they should get involved in.
oh yes, a lot of different extracurricular activities if they can. Absolutely, if it be sports or dance or whatever they might enjoy.
Yeah, music, whatever.
Yep.
And as a parent, support them. Whatever they want to do, support them. One of our particular children, we won't mention the name, tended to bounce around to different interests.
We were really trying to find the thing that this person
Yeah,
would.
that's fine.
Yeah.
Totally fine.
And we found it, right? We eventually found that thing.
We did. Yeah. Third, positive, help your teenager embrace being different. We warned our kids that by being Christian and being put out in the secular world, they would be treated differently, and they needed to be proud of it. That is the way that Jesus warned his followers, that they would be out in the world and they would be persecuted. Now, our children may not be persecuted, they may, but they may not, but they will be made fun of. There's no question about that. And so encourage your children to embrace that reality, especially embrace things like being a virgin, being proud of being a virgin, embracing the jokes, the jests, the laughter that comes with it. And that's why siblings are so important, because they can be in it together, right? This is what a Jorgensen does. This is what we expect a Jorgensen to be, and they fall in line. Also, you had mentioned don't follow fads. And teach your kids not to follow fads. Whenever they would come out with a new toy that was faddish, we would never go out and get it.
Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, or the Power, whatever it was.
Yeah.
We were against the fads because we didn't want them to be like the world. It's not that those things were bad.
Right.
It's just a way to prepare them to be different.
Yeah. And don't follow Christian fads. They
Yeah.
can be just as bad habitually, getting in a bad habit of following fads than secular fads. So stay away from it all. Fourth, work to have an open dialogue about sexuality. We know it's all around them. They know it's all around them. You want to be available to talk about anything, to be as open and least shy as you possibly can be, so that if they have any questions, they feel comfortable going to you. Don't make faces. Don't get squeamish. Embrace it, because if they don't go to you, they're going to go to somebody, and you certainly don't want them to go to certain sources that will, brainwash them, obscure the reality or the truth or the beauty of sexuality that they can eventually.
And the
know.
message out there today is very skewed. And just watch any TV show. Multiple partners is just
Yeah.
that's the way of it.
And the main principle I'm alluding to is sex not talked about becomes another subject that is taboo, and thus when it becomes taboo, it's more tempting.
Yeah.
So be as open as you can about sexuality. Which that leads us to dating.
Yay.
Should you allow your children to date? And what's the first principle before even talking about dating?
Marry a Christian.
Marry a Christian. That is to be ingrained in our children.
Can you say brainwashed?
Yeah, exactly. We need to brainwash our children to that they are going to marry, that they will marry Christians. You had two stories about that.
I just remember an elderly woman in our church was talking with our 3-year-old daughter about boyfriends or something. And
Do you have a boyfriend?
yeah, that type of thing. And of course she said no. She goes, but I'm going to marry a Christian. And she was so taken with that. She thought that was great. And it's true. As soon as they could talk, we would talk about, you will marry a Christian someday.
Yeah.
And then that brings me to probably middle school. I had a son come up to me and he said, Mom, would you be okay if I married a black woman? And without hesitation, I just said, as long as she's a Christian. And lo and behold, he did marry a black woman who is a Christian.
Prophetic. Now we know that dating is a tough subject because many Christians do it differently. We started to take the what do you used to call it? What approach the
My darling.
you know, courtship. Courtship.
Oh.
We used to think about doing a courtship. We kind of quasi did
Did
that.
our own.
Yeah, it's kind of our own. But our principle was that our children are not allowed to date in high school. That we wanted them to understand dating to be that which you do when you're pursuing a mate, future spouse, and because they were a long way away from nuptials while in high school, we did not want them to be dating, and so we didn't allow our children to go on dates. We didn't allow them to go to dances until their senior prom. Then we allowed them to go. So one of the reasons why we did that is we know the scene enough to know that a lot of bad things can happen and not a lot of good things can happen when two young people who are attracted to each other and have hormones raging go out and are alone together. So we try to steer our children away from scars that would, whether it be emotional or physical scars, that could take place because the dating scene is so charged with sexuality. That was our stance, and what we found was that the prospects, the people who were attracted to our children, didn't understand that and even took offense to it, thinking it was against them or personal to them, when of course it wasn't. Now, we didn't know that they were doing that. We found out later that these potential dates thought that we were making this policy personal. So you might want to explain it to them if you get a chance, because your teenager's not going to do it or not going to do it well, because they might not agree with your policy. But we found it to be one that was helpful. We hope it was. I'd like to hear more of our children's perspective on that. We've talked about that before.
I don't know if we would have done it any differently. We
Yeah.
do believe we helped them in their making their marriages now solid, in the sense they
Yeah.
don't have a lot of baggage they're bringing.
Yeah.
But we did learn too, as much as we tried to, I don't know, word I want to use. We learned that we couldn't parent their heart. We had several of them still have, boyfriend, girlfriends that we didn't know about.
Yeah.
And you can't tame the heart. And for some, it worked out really well, and they have a solid marriage, and it was wonderful. And others, it didn't work out well.
You mean as far as
Them having girlfriends or boyfriends in high school.
right? Well, you say you don't want to say it didn't work out well. God did what He needed to do.
Sure.
Yeah. It just had some heartache with it.
Sure.
Yeah. We did achieve a goal, though. Our goal was that no one could be in a family picture unless they were engaged, and we didn't want old family photos from, let's say, our oldest son's wedding.
In fact, rip someone out.
To have family picture with somebody in there that didn't end up being part of our family, and we succeeded on that. So, yay for us. Yeah. So, we had a talk when we were thinking about raising teenagers. How many questions there likely are out there in terms of
Practical stuff.
yeah,
practical
dances.
issues.
Do we allow our children to go to dances? Do we allow them to go to parties? What about drugs and the dangers of? Now they're talking about making marijuana no longer a federal crime. That's going through the Senate. That's going to mean that marijuana is that much more available to our children. And I do have some things to say about that, warnings about that. Tattoos, allowable or not? All these things that you're going to face as a parent, or your children are going to question.
Swimsuits, that's an issue.
What's that?
What type of swimsuit?
Type of swimsuit, yeah, type of swimsuit. We don't want to get picky about certain issues, because for us, we've got to have principles in front of us, and then we've got to encourage you to make decisions according to your family and according to the principles and how they would be applied to your family. So I don't want to give a blanket statement about all of these topics, and I wouldn't be able to cover all of them. So our invitation to you is, if you have a question about something like what I've mentioned, and you'd like to see
Just a leaf.
a leaf, and if you have a question about one of these topics and you'd like to see how we would work through that, go ahead and toss it our way, and we'd love to try to exemplify how we would work through it, or how we did work through it. Our next gathering, we hope to have a few of our children, maybe one at least, on, and we'd like to ask them some questions about their upbringing, see if they can give you further insight, things that were good, things were not so good, things they need to, that they would institute in their child rearing, and things that they need to be gracious to us about. So hopefully that'll occur soon enough. We're going on vacation next week, so well, maybe we'll do it on vacation.
We could. Yes, we're going with our
That
children.
would be interesting. Okay. But until then, thank you all for tuning in. We hope to hear from some of you if you have any questions. Gullis?